Hello. Well, shall we get started? Okay, this week we are back to covering the book Effective Testing in RSpec 3, and we'll be on chapter 7, which starts us into section 3 on organizing code. So, that said, let's go ahead and jump on into it. So the book starts out with mentioning we've written a few short examples, we've done a few things here and there, but we want to be able to organize our specs into something a little bit more coherent and how we're going to actually make a framework for that. And they mention you're not supposed to memorize all the RSpec syntax. I mean, I certainly don't either. The book's authors mentioned they don't. I mean, half the time I have an entire laundry list worth of cheat sheets over on a side window somewhere that I'm glancing at just to make sure I know what's going on. So, do you have to know it all? No, but it's nice to know some of these things exist so you know what to look for. Okay. And it mentions well structured specs are more than just tidiness. Sometimes we need to have specific behavior to specific groups, such as setting up data, custom error handling, and that relies a lot on good grouping. So they are going to start out with talking about grouping. So let's see what they got here. Okay, so they start in with mentioning getting words right here. So specs can't exist on their own. First spec, let's see here. Example group fulfills multiple purposes of giving logical structure, describing the context, providing a Ruby class to act as a scope, and running common setup and teardown. So basics of things. We're starting here on that first section of this chapter. Let's see here. We have describe for an example group and it for a single example. So we have some of those basics here. Let's just keep it a markdown. And then we'll just copy some stuff they have in here and go from there. Okay, so that could be describing a lot of things within its class, module, object. They have a few different examples here. Let's see here. And then you could even combine it. I always forget about this one, which is something like, let's say, that. Which I'm not exactly sure what that outputs. I'm going to have to test that later. Well, I'm learning things too. So they mention why care about the class name instead of just making this a string? Well, a few reasons. The book's probably going to mention this in a second. But among those, no, we're doing Ruby. We're doing two-space indentation. Where is that? No. Okay, that's better. So anyway, why do we care about the class name instead of a string? Well, first off, this constant has to exist, otherwise Ruby's going to error. So if you spell that wrong, you're going to have some issues there. The second thing is you might have something along the lines of subject inside here, and it'd be kind of annoying to have to keep saying gardening API.something whenever you could just say described class.something, which will allow you to refer to whatever's being described, which is very useful if you happen to have any type of inheritance or anything else going on here, like it behaves like X or something like that, shared examples, which we'll get into later, I'd assume. So there are reasons why that's useful. Yep, and it also works with metadata, such as, let's say, system true or something like that, which allow you to run specs by only certain tags. Let's see here. What else do they have here? So then they get into mentioning context versus describe. So for those of you who are not aware, strictly speaking, context describe, same thing, not really any difference except for the semantics of it. And what do I mean by semantics? Well, describe is describing something. It's describing a noun. Well, I wouldn't say a noun. Let's see here. Describing, yeah, let's say a noun, a single class, a method, a module. You're describing something. A context, on the other hand, for me and for the book probably here in a second, is describing what are we doing with it. Like, for instance, when it is in spring, we'll have something else in there. Yeah, notice the old classic Rubyist habit of I use single, so now I'm going to actually spell out contractions. Cheap, but it works. Anyway, so the one that the book actually uses, let's mimic this real quick. So, for instance, a kettle of water could be in a lot of different states, like when boiling, and that's the one the book mentions. We might have something like when empty, when cold, when a bunch of other things like that. And that's what context is useful for. It's describing this object in this particular context should behave like these things. And that's where you get a lot of your specs and a lot of your behavior groupings there. Let's see here. So example instead of it. You know, honestly, I have never really seen a usage of example in the wild, but apparently very similar idea to that, in which example is effectively it. Let's see here what the book is exactly saying. It has helpful aliases, most time describing a subject in a sentence, like a kettle of water can make tea. Pronoun it makes a lot of sense. Other times, providing several data examples rather than several sentences about a subject. Instance might be describing telephone number parser. Want to demonstrate it works with multiple phone formats. Okay, I can be sold on that. See, I learned things too instead. Let's see here. Okay, so the example it's using here, let's just go ahead and do this. Okay, so we have that. So we have that. Yeah, I can see where this might make more sense. Because otherwise, if you use it in here, it doesn't sound quite right. But again, semantics, you probably get away with not doing it, but it might not look as good. Let's see here. And catch all in case neither one works would be specify. Where each example has its own subject. I'll have to look more to specify. I'm not exactly sure about that one. Can't say I've used it myself. I've primarily 99% of the time used it, but I might be convinced to use examples sometime later. Okay. So RSpec is not limited to those. For instance, you could have bugs related to database, price for style debugging. Let's see here. New aliases like pit, which is pry. That's interesting. I've never seen that one before. So what it's saying here is I'm guessing it's just adding a certain tag to it, which is how it works. I'm guessing as well that's how exit and a few of these other ones work. Okay, so afterhook only works on pry metadata being these two up here with pry set to true. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I haven't seen either of those before. Anyway, so next section we have over here is sharing common logic. Let's see here. Several techniques to share common setup logic. 3 tools being let definitions, hooks, and helper methods. Snippet that describes each of these. So let's go ahead and copy that down. I can't spell today. Got that, got that. So we'd have let statements. They'll call them hooks instead of blocks, okay. Okay, if I remember right, we did actually change that up a little bit. Success, expense ID, error message, yeah. Personally, I still prefer the keyword arguments because we can tell what we're doing a little bit more cleanly there. And then they also have that help method. So, quick fun one for folks. You might notice I had to switch to this in last example class. Why is that? Because what I had done was let Jason here, which was this, and I was getting some interesting failures. What happened is that there was more than one request being made. So what they would do is they do post once and then get once to verify it, which meant that this let had already been triggered. And in the same example, that means that it's already cached, which means it's going to have the previous result from the post request whenever the get request runs, which is why we'd end up having to do this instead. So something to keep an eye out for. Anyway, let's see here. So let definitions, we had a few examples of those previously in the book, so the book doesn't mention covering those too terribly much. It does mention getting into hooks. So we have before, but we also have after and around. And then those could also have options of, say, suites, all, example, each, something like that, which are something like I want to run before all, after all, around each. And you get a little bit of use after this. Let's see here. So what they mention in the book is something around lines of my app configuration, got that, got that. So before example, do that. Nope, go back over here. So for instance, if we're going to manipulate the environment of something, we could put it back afterwards. Now, that said, we could also use transactions, yes, but I would almost avoid doing this because then you get some very weird results. Like, let's say that this happened, and then the specs which ran after that were, let's call this A. So for instance, A1.1 might run, which is first example, great first it block. So that might run, but you might also have B run or C run or D run, in which case this original env right here or the environment of whatever in the world we're manipulating might also be getting transformed. So this is where some of the dependency injection stuff can make sense to make sure that you're not mutating global state. I mean, anytime I see something like, say, environment, let's just put them right here. Let's say environment puts or srand or other things like this. Like we just recently had a case at work where someone was manipulating srand to try and get some, excuse me. So what they were doing was something like srand3. Well, let's just make a new thing. So they had something along the lines of that, and then you had an example inside here. Now, I'm not sure exactly what SRAN 5 would end up giving us. Yeah, I mean, we can test it real quick. Okay. So it would do something, and I don't remember exactly what, but what we ended up doing is that you actually have a way to do something along the lines of that instead, to where you could have something which is a little bit easier to predict what's going on. But in general, if you happen to notice that you're manipulating global state somewhere like that, try and make it into local state. Like, let's take this example up here where you happen to have the original env, and let's say that you had something in here, a.new or describe class.new, and you're passing it env, you might have somewhere in said described class something like this, where you're cloning that environment and making it a local state instead of a global state. That way, anything you do inside of here to manipulate env is referring to this clone, or you should probably deep clone it depending on what exactly you're doing. But make the global local, which is going to be a lot easier to test and going to be a lot more deterministic and give you a lot less strange errors potentially. Okay, so let's keep going in the book real quick here. Okay, book has a warning here which says when you're setting up database logic that doesn't cleanly fit into transactional around hook, you want to consider either before or after hook. In situations where recommend to use a before hook. If you forget to add the before hook to a particular spec, the failure happened in that example, not the later one. That's fair. When you run a single example to diagnose failure, records stick around in the database so that you can investigate them. Okay. So a lot of these round hooks are great for transactional things, like you might have something such as I don't remember exactly how around works. Oh, right, that was it. So what they were doing here was that. So it could be something like this, or it could be something like, I don't remember exactly what transitions look like, but something like this, where you'd run the entire example inside a transaction. Okay, so we have that. Config hooks. If you're wanting to do that for the global level, you can put them in here. Oops, nope, that is an argument. You might notice I alternate between using parentheses here. Let's say that we had a method that takes a block. we had that. So that will work. But if we happen to switch this over to this syntax, you'll notice the hint is that Ruby's already complaining. That's because you have some ambiguousness of the syntax there. So something to watch out for. So in this case, where there's do end, I can get away with that. But if I were to switch it to this, why does that not work? Well, this is now ambiguous. Is this a hash argument? Is this a block? Ruby doesn't know. Ruby has a hard time with this. So that's why you'll see something like describe, no parentheses, do, even though you could technically use parentheses there. Anyway, fun little thing. So back to the book on the round example. Let's see here. So we got those. Okay. So what it's doing here is wrapping every example in this environment clone. I've also seen this used for database cleaners for transactions for a few other things, which, by the way, if you are using database cleaner, make sure that you have it set to transactional to where it'll undo things instead of to purge the entire database, because that's expensive and really, really slow. Okay. So global hooks reduce duplication, but can lead to surprising action at a distance in your specs. Action at a distance is you are down in spec, let's say A, B, C, D, .rb. So you could be all the way down here, and then you have that around being called from the configuration, which is kind of hard to trace. So you need to worry about some of those things a little bit as far as making it understandable, which is why if you have too much stuff happening in all these files, you try and dry up your specs too much, well, you end up with something really hard to follow. Let's see here. So scope. Most of the hooks now are run once per example. So you can set it to examples. Some hooks, though, have really intensive operations like creating a bunch of database tables, launching live web browser. Running hook once per spec would be cost prohibitive. Yep, if you're doing a bunch of factories before each spec, that might not make much sense. So in that, we might use something like before context to do something expensive. So that could be something along the lines of that. Let's see here. So it mentions using context hooks in probably wider scope, more you have to be careful of this. So with a context hook, you have to clean up the resulting state. Otherwise, it cannot cause other specs to pass or fail incorrectly. And especially with database code, that can be annoying. Let's see here. And then you might even have something like a suite level hook, which typically will show up in somewhere like this. And that might be something like removing a temporary directory. Now, it mentions you can only call this in the top level RSpec configure. If you are calling it in specs, it's going to break, which is probably good because the wider the scope, the more you have to clean up, but the tighter the scope, the more you can have it clean itself up. Let's see here. So before each and before all were the terms that used to use for example and context. You know, that said, I've been using each and all for so many years, I haven't really thought about the other way around, but those words do make more sense. I might have to make a Rubicop to replace all those in all of our specs as well. Okay. So as far as hooks, it does also mention example running order. If you have one example group nested inside another, hooks will run in the following order: before runs from the outside on in, and after runs from the inside out. Around hooks behaving similarly. Beginning of each round hook, bits before example.run will be run like a before hook, and the other part will be run like an after. So hooks have a couple of purpose. Books mention removing duplicated or incidental details to be distracted the reader from the point of your example, and expressing English descriptions of what your example code is actually executing. So database transactions are one of the big ones that it's mentioning here. Like around each example that happens to be tagged with DB. So you might have something like rollback on each of these transactions. Let's see here. And then the second type of example was if we go back up to this allow ledger to receive record. This is also before hook, but it's describing to us what exactly we expect to be allowed to happen in the broader range of our code. Question is, how much do you put in the before hooks versus how much do you put into the examples? For me, some of the setup and some of the expectations of what gets called that shared across these specs, I'll put in there. But where I draw a line is allow is great. You can put that in there, but you want to put expect in the example, such as if you had something like allow ledger to do that, sure, but if you had something like expect ledger to be valid, you're probably going to want to put that in the actual example assertion. Why there? Because I'd like to, even if this line gets shared across 5, 6, 20, 30 specs, I still want to know what exactly the expectations are for whatever I'm testing, what exactly I'm allowing it to receive, and stubbing it. That behavior, sure, pulled out into there, but this is going to be a little bit preference-based. So let's see here. Helper methods, it goes back into those. Let's see here. So the book mentions a fairly complicated example over here. I'm not sure how this is going to work if I paste it in here. So let's see how much of a mess this will make. Because all these books have interesting little formatting stuff on them. Okay, so don't need that. Okay, so it's only minorly messed up. Well, a little bit more than minorly, but you get what I'm saying. Okay, so let's see where exactly that one was starting here. Got that, got that. Weird. I wonder why the indentation was breaking like that. Okay, so got that, and got that. Yeah, okay, it's mixing tabs and spaces, that's why. I'm not going to spend too terribly much more time on that. Okay, so what exactly is it mentioning that we want to trace through here? So when we run the first example, and by first example, I'm going to get rid of these comments real quick just so we have a little bit more space to see. So before this first example, we expect fare to equal 2.7. So it says that the before hook on the fourth line here starts to run first. And then we refer to the ticket that happens on this line right here. Okay. And then reference starting station, which is going to occur right here. And then references ending station, which occurs right here. And then it references fare, which occurs right here, which also hits tickets. So what the book is mentioning is we jumped around multiple different lines, around here, around here, around here, through here, through here. And it gets confusing as to where exactly we're even at whenever we're doing this type of stuff. Now, let's say it has multiple examples, multiple files, and it's grown to several hundred lines of code. It's going to be pesky to actually get that traced down. So the book mentions an alternative, which is going to be using a helper method to try and condense some of that. And I definitely have seen a lot of cases where someone has nested the heck out of... Oh no. Let's see if I can select one of those spaces. Aha, got it. Yeah, that's the problem with copying from books, is that they have some weird symbols in there. So in this case, they're wrapping all of that in a helper method instead, which is much easier to work with. So instead of all that jumping back and forth, you actually have what you're describing in line with one thing, and you can tell more accurately from therefore what exactly you're doing. Otherwise, you're jumping through all these levels of nested context to try and see what's going on. For me, if I see 4 or 5 layers of nested lets on there, like let's go back to here of ticket, fare, jump into here, jump into here. Sure, technically you deduplicated things, but that becomes really dang hard to read. Okay, and then putting helpers into modules. The book mentions one of the other ones that we had there. Which is tagged with DB. So it might have something like that for helper methods. There are ways you can do this in the top level RSpec configuration. In fact, there probably is going to be an example of that somewhere in here. Aha, yep, there it is. Personally, I prefer doing something like this unless it's very isolated type of spec, but I prefer to also hide those behind certain types. So if I remember right, it was something along the lines of DB true or something like that for the tags. Let's see here. Actually, let's look that up real quick. let's see here. Define helper method. Include helpers, extend helpers, foo bar. There we go. Yep, that's what we're looking for. So in this case, it's tag and value. So we might have something like include capybara helpers for all system specs or something like that, or only this for request specs or only this for unit specs. So that's useful for a lot of these things. Let's make it a little bit bigger just so people can see that. So RSpec configure, include what, and then tag and expected values. So in this case, db true, for instance. So in that case, we could have something like, I mean, could I have it on db true? Yes, but rack true maybe. Anyway, you get the point of you can include some of these. So let's see what we got here on shared example groups. So that's a little bit more extracted than let. I mean, with let, you end up with some of those issues we mentioned beforehand of using that helper method, but shared context can sometimes get this even worse because then you end up with things separated over multiple files. So shared context include context for common setup and helper logic, and shared examples include examples for examples. Okay. So let's see here. The shared context they're going to mention here is going to be that. Markdown really does not like indentation. Okay. So we have something like that, and then we could do inside one of our specs something like this afterwards. Weird mixed tab things again. Okay. And that could also happen in configuration at the top level here. So let's grab this. So we could do that. We could also do something like rack true or some other type of tag on there. Then sharing examples could be something like an interface store. Let's see here. Okay, so without that, you might start with something like, let's copy this, this, get rid of that, get rid of that. Okay, so we might start with a KV store like this. Then what exactly is it proposing that we do? Turning that into a shared example. Then that takes an argument of KV store class. So then that could be used for any type of key value store over there. And then those would typically go in spec/support. Then let's see here. An example of actually using that might be this. Let's see how much more we got in here. Okay. Okay, so book mentions that works fine for one, but it does not work fine if we happen to have multiple included examples at that level. That means that one would overwrite the other and we would not get what we're looking for here. So what the book is probably going to mention is nesting that instead. Okay, let's see here. What's the difference between these two? Ah, right, I used that one instead of the second one. So included examples explicitly inlines it. It behaves like. We'll have those both be at the same peerage. Okay. Gotcha. When in doubt, use it behaves like. Almost always one you want, no context leak. And when would we use it, include examples in? Okay. Only when sure that it won't conflict with anything. Okay. Sharing groups with blocks. Let's see here. Okay. So inside of here, you could do some things like, say, that. And then provide some additional configuration inside of there. Okay, so I think that is all the book had for these few sections. So that looks like all the content the book has for chapter 7, so I'm probably going to leave it there. Do we have any questions before we call it for today? Okay. As far as any closing words, with a lot of shared behaviors on specs and a lot of ways of deduplicating things, do make sure that the deduplication does not make your specs harder to understand, because otherwise you're going to end up with a lot of indirection of having to go from A to B to C to D to E to F to try and find out where a certain variable is being set, where a certain configuration is being set. If you end up having some type of 5 layers deep nested of lets, try and flatten that into a helper method. If you end up with a lot of shared context and examples, see if there's a way that you can simplify that as well. It's make your specs understandable first. Don't worry too terribly much about duplication. That happens. Because if you get too dry, well, dry as don't repeat yourself, yes. But if you end up getting too dry, you end up becoming brittle, which would be badly refactored into tiny things lacking expressiveness. So do be careful that you don't take things too far to extremes Otherwise, most of the code is going to be incomprehensible. And the purpose of specs, first and foremost, is not to be the most concise code possible, but to be very descriptive of what's happening, what behaviors your application expects, and what you want to get out of it. So do spend a little bit of extra characters on that, extra white space, extra understandability, legibility into your specs, and don't worry too much about repeating yourself on that. But anyway, I think that's all we have for today. So thank you so much for coming out, and we will see you again here in a few weeks for RSpec. And next week we'll be back to the performance class. As always, you can join us at rubylearning.dev, where you can find some links to books, resources, as well as our Discord channel if you'd like to ask any questions or get feedback on anything. Well, thanks for your time and have a great day.